In the brutal skies of the Pacific and European theaters of World War II, American bomber crews faced a deadly paradox: they were armed to the teeth, yet still being torn apart by enemy fighters. Every mission over Germany or the Pacific Islands meant flying into swarms of agile interceptors, the Japanese Zero or the German FW-190, that attacked in coordinated waves, slicing through bomber formations with devastating accuracy. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were formidable machines, bristling with machine guns, but their defensive fire was notoriously ineffective in the early years of the war. Crews would return with bullet-riddled wings, shredded fuselages, and empty gun barrels, yet few enemy planes downed. The problem, as post-mission reports revealed, wasn't the lack of courage or firepower. It was the way American gunners were aiming. For years, they were taught to shoot at the target, to place the enemy aircraft in the center of their gunsight and fire. But at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, that training was tragically outdated. Bullets took fractions of a second to travel the distance, and by the time they reached the point of aim, the enemy had already passed through and vanished. This realization sparked one of the most remarkable transformations in aerial gunnery, a fundamental shift in philosophy that would double the effectiveness of every .50 caliber gun in the sky. The revolution began quietly, in the smoky classrooms and testing ranges of the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School. Engineers, scientists, and instructors started to ask a simple but revolutionary question: what if gunners aimed not at the plane, but behind it? The logic was rooted in physics and experience. In air combat, speed and angle were everything. Enemy fighters rarely attacked straight on, they came from above, from the side, from behind, closing at combined speeds so high that traditional aiming was useless. The bullet, once fired, needed time to travel, and in that time, the enemy plane moved through space. To hit it, the gunner had to aim where it would be, not where it was. Yet this theory was counterintuitive for most young gunners, many of whom had come from farms or factories, where aiming meant aligning sights directly on a static target. The concept of deflection shooting, or leading the target, was alien to them. But combat reports proved it worked. Crews who adopted this new method began scoring more kills, often shooting down attackers before they could complete a second pass. Slowly, the doctrine spread through the ranks, transforming American bombers from lumbering prey into deadly fortresses capable of tearing apart enemy formations before they got within lethal range. The transformation wasn't merely about aim, it was about understanding motion, distance, and timing in 3 dimensions. Every engagement was a dance of trajectories, angles, and seconds. Training films like Flexible Gunnery, The Deadly Sky and combat firing at high speed drilled the new concepts into recruits. They practiced on moving targets that simulated diving fighters, using complex optical devices and camera guns that recorded where their shots would have landed. For the first time, mathematics and psychology merged in gunnery instruction. The human instinct to aim directly at danger had to be overridden by precision logic. "Don't chase the target," instructors would shout over the roar of engines, "lead it, shoot where it's going, not where it is." Soon, gunners learned to visualize invisible geometry in the air, bullet arcs, convergence points, and flight paths intersecting in a split second of destruction. This mental shift changed everything. By mid-1944, the results were staggering. Gunner training had evolved from crude instinct to disciplined science. The U.S. Army Air Forces began to record a doubling, and in some squadrons, a tripling, of confirmed kills. Bombers that had once limped home full of holes were now returning with stories of enemy planes bursting into flame mid-attack. The shift in aiming philosophy saved countless lives and allowed strategic bombing campaigns to press deeper into enemy territory. Behind every victory was the quiet triumph of learning, of men who adapted faster than their enemies, who dared to aim behind rather than at their foes. The sky, once ruled by chaos and guesswork, had become a calculated battlefield, where mathematics and muscle memory converged in a deadly art form that turned defense into dominance. The breakthrough in aerial gunnery that changed the course of the air war did not happen overnight. It was born from frustration, failure, and the grim mathematics of loss. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, the skies over Europe were stained with smoke trails and the burning wrecks of downed bombers. The U.S. 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, was suffering horrifying casualty rates. On some missions, 1 out of every 3 aircraft never came back. Enemy fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fw 190 would dive in from the sun, guns blazing, then roll away untouched, leaving the bombers riddled with holes. For the men inside those flying fortresses, each attack was a test of endurance and coordination. They fired back with everything they had, .50 caliber machine guns mounted in turrets, waist positions, and nose blisters, but their hit rates were abysmal. It wasn't uncommon for an entire formation to unleash thousands of rounds without downing a single fighter. When the after-action reports came in, one grim pattern emerged: the gunners were missing consistently, even when the enemy planes seemed squarely in their sights. Something was deeply wrong with the way they were aiming. That realization led to one of the most innovative training programs of the entire war, the flexible gunnery school system. Across America, from Harlingen, Texas to Las Vegas, Nevada, thousands of young men were being turned into aerial marksmen in a matter of weeks. The instructors there, many of whom were combat veterans, began noticing that traditional marksmanship principles didn't apply when the target was moving at hundreds of miles per hour. They designed a series of experiments to test how perception, timing, and motion affected accuracy. Using motorized target sleds, camera guns, and even mechanical simulators, they discovered that the human brain struggled to process relative motion at high speed. Aiming directly at the target was an instinctive reaction, but the bullets always lagged behind. The data was irrefutable. Even a tenth of a second's delay at combat speeds could translate to a miss of several aircraft lengths. The only way to compensate was to aim ahead or behind, depending on the fighter's angle of attack. This became the foundation of what they called predicted aiming, a method that turned aerial defense into a science of anticipation. One of the unsung heroes of this transformation was Colonel Charles W. Chuck Sweeney, a gunnery training officer who pushed for more realistic, high-stress exercises. He understood that teaching gunners in static classrooms was useless. They needed to feel the adrenaline, the chaos, and the noise of combat. Sweeney's team introduced innovative systems like the synthetic trainer, a mechanical dome where trainees could aim at projected images of attacking aircraft. The device recorded every movement of their gunsight, analyzing whether they were leading correctly. For many young airmen, this was their first experience understanding what aiming behind truly meant. They began to realize that bullets didn't travel instantly, they had a time of flight, a curve, and a lag. The illusion of aiming directly at the target had to be replaced with the discipline of trusting invisible math. It was not easy. Some men resisted, arguing that their instincts were better than that new science. But those who embraced the method soon saw results in the field. When the first missions were flown by crews trained under Sweeney's doctrine, the kill ratios changed dramatically. German pilots, once fearless in their head-on attacks, began reporting a new kind of resistance, bombers that seemed to shoot with uncanny precision, hitting them even as they banked away. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the same doctrine was being tested under vastly different skies. Against the Japanese Zero, a plane that could outturn and outclimb almost anything the U.S. had early in the war, American crews were desperate for any advantage. The flexible gunners aboard B-17s, B-24s, and even the smaller B-25 Mitchell bombers began applying the same aim-behind principle with astonishing success. Japanese pilots, used to making lightning-fast passes, were suddenly finding themselves flying directly into streams of well-placed fire. Reports from the Solomon Islands and New Guinea told of entire Zero squadrons being shredded mid-attack. Intelligence officers studying the gun camera footage realized something profound: the Americans had learned to use their slower-firing machine guns with surgical precision, creating deadly zones of overlapping fire that compensated for the enemy's superior maneuverability. This new discipline of deflection shooting was turning the tide of air combat. The same bomber formations that had once been easy prey were now floating fortresses in the truest sense, able to destroy attacking planes before they could even complete a firing pass. The cultural change within the Air Force was just as dramatic as the tactical one. Gunnery training was no longer about brute reflexes, it became an intellectual pursuit. Trainees studied diagrams of bullet trajectories, learned to estimate angles of approach, and even practiced mental tracking, a form of visualization that let them predict enemy motion before it happened. Every movement of the gun turret became a calculated response to geometry and time. Some training manuals even borrowed from baseball, comparing aerial gunnery to hitting a fast-moving pitch. "You don't swing where the ball is," one instructor famously told his class, "you swing where it's going." The idea resonated deeply, turning abstract theory into relatable instinct. By the end of 1943, this new mindset had spread through every gunnery school, every bomber squadron, and every combat briefing. The results were measurable and immediate. The 8th Air Force reported a near 100% increase in kill claims, while the average number of rounds expended per confirmed hit dropped by more than half. In other words, not only were gunners hitting more often, they were wasting fewer bullets. By the time the Allies began their strategic bombing of Germany in full force in 1944, the skies had changed. Where once enemy fighters dove fearlessly into formations, now they hesitated, wary of the invisible geometry that seemed to predict their every move. U.S. bombers flew deeper and struck harder, with fewer losses. The doctrine of aiming behind the target had evolved from a counterintuitive theory into a cornerstone of air warfare. It proved that success in combat wasn't just about strength or courage, it was about the ability to learn, to adapt, and to see the invisible. In that transformation lay the essence of America's aerial victory, the power of reason and training over instinct and chaos. By late 1944, the aim behind doctrine had become standard across nearly every U.S. bomber crew in the air. What began as a counterintuitive concept had evolved into a universal principle that governed aerial defense. But while the new aiming philosophy doubled the effectiveness of defensive fire, it also reshaped how American airmen thought about warfare itself. The gunner's position, once considered secondary to the pilots and bombardiers, now became a critical element of mission success. Every flight briefing began with target geometry discussions, approach vectors, attack angles, and timing estimates. Gunners were drilled to calculate lead times instinctively, judging the difference between a fighter coming in from the 3 o'clock position versus one diving from above. This wasn't just about reflex, it was about understanding the physics of motion under pressure. As one instructor at the Harlingen Gunnery School put it, a good gunner doesn't aim with his eyes. He aims with his mind. That phrase would echo through the halls of training bases and briefing rooms until it became a mantra of modern aerial combat. The physical environment of a bomber only amplified the challenge. Inside a B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator, the temperature could plummet to -40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. Frost would coat the gun barrels, and oxygen masks would freeze to the gunners' faces. The roar of engines and the vibration of the aircraft made even basic communication nearly impossible. Under these brutal conditions, a man had to maintain calm focus, track a rapidly moving target, and visualize invisible angles in the sky. The new aiming method required such precision that even a fraction of a second's hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Many gunners described combat as a strange mix of panic and clarity, a tunnel vision where time slowed, and training took over. They no longer aimed directly at enemy aircraft. They visualized where the fighter would be a heartbeat later and pulled the trigger on that prediction. It was almost an act of faith. They couldn't see the hit until the fighter exploded or disintegrated in the distance, but when it did, the satisfaction was indescribable. To refine this deadly art, the Army Air Forces turned increasingly to science. Ballistics experts, psychologists, and engineers collaborated to improve not only technique but also tools. One major advancement was the K-14 gunsight, an optical computing device that automatically calculated lead angles based on the enemy's speed and direction. It was a marvel of engineering, a compact mechanical brain that turned gunners into precision instruments. When combined with proper training, the K-14 nearly eliminated guesswork. Instructors emphasized that even with such technology, success still depended on understanding the principles of deflection and time of flight. Training manuals from 1944 feature detailed diagrams showing bullet paths curving through the air like invisible threads intersecting with the target's flight line. Camera gun footage from combat missions became invaluable educational material, replayed frame by frame to study hits and misses. This marriage of experience and technology became a cornerstone of the U.S. air strategy, human intuition enhanced by scientific precision. In combat zones, the results were dramatic. Over Europe, Luftwaffe pilots began to alter their attack tactics, realizing that their old maneuvers were being anticipated and countered with devastating accuracy. The once favored 12 o'clock high head-on attack, a maneuver that had terrified American crews early in the war, became a death trap. Bomber formations now opened fire at exactly the right moment, their bullets converging into lethal walls of lead that shredded enemy aircraft mid-dive. Veterans recalled scenes where German fighters seemed to disintegrate before they even reached firing range. In the Pacific, similar reports emerged. Japanese Zeros, famous for their agility, were being cut down by bombers whose gunners no longer panicked or fired wildly. A B-24 waist gunner named Thomas Tex McGregor described one such encounter over the Philippines. You could see the Zero banking in from the right. The old instinct says pull the trigger when he's in your sights. But we knew better now. I held off, just a touch, aimed a breath behind him, and the next second he flew right into it. One burst, and he was gone. This new breed of gunner had become something unique in the annals of warfare. They weren't just defenders, they were tacticians, physicists, and psychologists all at once. The shift in training philosophy meant that every man behind a gun was now capable of independent judgment. Formation gunners began communicating not just with words, but with intuition, understanding each other's firing zones and predicting how their bullets would overlap in the air. The sky around the bomber formation became an invisible fortress of calculated trajectories. It wasn't chaos anymore, it was choreography. Machine guns from tail to nose worked in harmony, their arcs crossing at predicted kill points. German pilots later reported that approaching a B-17 group felt like flying into a cage of invisible blades. The Americans had mastered not only the art of defense but the psychology of deterrence. The Luftwaffe's aggressive spirit began to wane, and by early 1945, their attacks were fewer, shorter, and often half-hearted. Behind this success was a deeper truth about human adaptability. War had forced ordinary men, mechanics, farmers, students, to become experts in physics under fire. They learned to suppress instinct and trust theory, to believe that aiming behind something could bring it down faster than aiming at it. That paradox became the foundation of a new military philosophy, the understanding that victory comes not from strength alone but from the mastery of knowledge and discipline. Even decades later, the lessons of the U.S. gunners would influence modern targeting systems, from radar-assisted turrets to heat-seeking missiles. The principle remained the same: anticipate the future position, not the present one. In every sense, the simple act of aiming behind the target had changed not only how wars were fought but how warriors thought. By the war's end, thousands of American gunners owed their survival to this revolutionary doctrine. Many would go home never fully realizing that they had been part of one of the most significant tactical evolutions in aerial combat history. To them, it was just training, something drilled into their muscle memory through endless hours of simulation and repetition. But in reality, they had rewritten the rules of the sky. The aim behind principle proved that even in the chaos of battle, intellect and precision could triumph over instinct and speed. It was a quiet, invisible victory, won not with bombs or heroics, but with a deeper understanding of motion, timing, and human perception. And in that victory lay the secret of why, in the closing years of World War II, American bombers began to dominate the heavens with deadly, mathematical perfection. Bloody conclusion: the legacy of the aim behind doctrine had become permanently etched into the DNA of American air power. What began as an adjustment to gunnery technique had evolved into a philosophy, a way of thinking that extended beyond combat itself. The men who once trembled at the sight of German or Japanese fighters now faced the enemy with cold precision, their fear replaced by calculation. Inside the frozen fuselages of B-17s, B-24s, and B-29s, gunners performed their deadly equations instinctively, merging human instinct with machine logic. They no longer sprayed bullets in desperation. Every trigger pull was a decision, a mathematical prediction carried out in the space of a heartbeat. The air war had matured into something almost surgical, and at its core lay this new understanding of motion, distance, and time. It was a triumph of intellect over panic, a transformation that not only changed outcomes in the air but also revealed something profound about the nature of modern warfare, that mastery of the invisible could shape the fate of nations. In the months leading up to Germany's surrender, the impact of the doctrine could be measured in hard numbers. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force's bomber losses had dropped by nearly half compared to the disastrous campaigns of 1943. Gun camera footage from missions over Berlin, Munich, and Dresden showed a level of accuracy that stunned even the analysts at Air Force Command. Enemy fighters no longer tore through formations unscathed, instead, they were meeting walls of calculated fire. A Luftwaffe ace, interviewed after capture, described his shock when his Bf-109 was hit while still maneuvering into position. "It felt like they knew where I would be before I did." He wasn't wrong. The Americans had learned to map the chaos of aerial battle into predictable patterns. They had turned the sky into a grid of timing and probability, where every burst of tracer fire traced a mathematical arc through destiny. And behind that precision were thousands of anonymous gunners, young men barely out of high school, whose understanding of the aim-behind method made them the invisible architects of Allied air supremacy. In the Pacific, the doctrine reached its ultimate test with the introduction of the B-29 Superfortress. These massive bombers flew higher, faster, and farther than anything that had come before, carrying the war directly to the Japanese home islands. The Zero was still a threat, but the American gunners aboard the B-29 had become masters of anticipation. They had learned to think in layers of motion, estimating not just the fighter's path but also compensating for altitude, wind, and the movement of their own aircraft. The bomber's remote-controlled turrets, guided by analog computers, extended that aim-behind philosophy into technology itself. The system automatically applied lead based on the relative speed of the target, turning each turret into a mechanical brain capable of executing what human gunners had once done instinctively. It was, in essence, the final evolution of the doctrine, a seamless fusion of man and machine that allowed precision to reign at 30,000 feet. Japanese pilots soon discovered that even attacking from blind spots offered no safety. The B-29s responded with cold, mechanical accuracy, cutting down interceptors before they could even line up a shot. The old rules of dogfighting no longer applied, the future had arrived in the form of predictive targeting. But behind the statistics and the technology were the stories of the men who made it work. Gunners who had once been terrified teenagers now spoke about combat like scientists describing an experiment. They could tell, by sight alone, how fast an enemy was closing, what his turn radius was, and exactly when to fire. Many credited their survival to this understanding. In diaries and post-war interviews, they described the eerie calm that came with mastery, the moment when fear gave way to clarity, when they could see the geometry of battle unfolding around them. One veteran, Jack "Red" Morrison, recalled, "The first time I aimed behind a plane and saw it burst into flames, I realized this wasn't luck. This was learning. This was science saving our lives." Such moments reflected the deeper truth of the war in the air, that victory came not only from courage but from comprehension. The better they understood the invisible forces at play, the longer they lived, and the more their formations survived to strike again. When peace finally came, the lessons of those skies didn't vanish. The aim-behind philosophy became a foundation for the post-war Air Force, influencing the design of radar-guided guns, heat-seeking missiles, and computer-assisted targeting systems. Engineers studying combat data recognized that the human brain had been performing, under stress, the same calculations that early analog computers would later automate. Every gunner who learned to lead the target had, in a sense, been acting as a living Ballistic computer. This realization shaped generations of weapons design. From jet fighters in Korea to guided missiles in Vietnam, the concept remained unchanged: anticipate motion, aim for the future, not the present. What those gunners discovered in the cold skies of Europe and the Pacific was not just a technique, it was a law of combat physics, one that would define warfare for decades to come. And yet, for all its science and precision, there was something deeply human at the heart of this story. The young men who learned to aim behind the enemy weren't mathematicians or engineers, they were sons, brothers, and friends who adapted under impossible conditions. They learned through loss, through fire, through watching others fall from the sky. They took something abstract and made it instinctive. The legacy of their learning lived on not in textbooks or manuals, but in the silent understanding passed from one generation of warriors to the next, that in the chaos of combat, the difference between survival and death often lies not in strength, but in thought. The act of aiming behind the target became more than a tactical lesson, it became a metaphor for foresight, discipline, and evolution. It symbolized humanity's ability to learn even in the darkest of times, to turn desperation into innovation, and to find logic amid destruction. By the end of World War II, the U.S. Army Air Forces had not only rewritten the science of aerial combat but had proven something greater, that knowledge could be as lethal as firepower. The sky had once been a place of confusion, where instinct ruled and luck decided fate. Now, it was governed by prediction, precision, and the quiet intellect of the men who refused to aim where they saw, and instead aimed where the enemy would be. The result was nothing short of revolutionary: twice as many enemy planes shot down, and countless American lives saved. And in that silent shift, one fraction of a second, one recalibrated angle, one redefined philosophy, the course of the air war changed forever.